This is The Weaver's Lass by Margery Bailey. The weaver and his wife, who lived in the village over the hill, were not at all pleased when the storks brought them a seventh little daughter. "Hey ho," sighed the weaver, "another mouth to feed, and this time fortune hath not even sent a boy, that the child can help in its own feeding." His wife sighed because he found reason to sigh in the new baby, but the old woman at the end of the lane was of quite different opinion. Said she, "And have you no eyes in your head? This child will make you your fortunes for sure and certain." The little lass was quite lovely, and as she grew, she became lovelier, so that it was a pleasure to look at her. Her chief glory was her golden hair, which hung about her like a curtain when it was not neatly braided and wound with a thong, and each hair was finer than the finest silk, and as bright as new money. "But for all that, it is not the kind of gold that buys bread," grumbled the weaver, and nothing must do but the little lass learn to weave and put bread in the mouths of her family. The 6 elder sisters sat still and spun, but the youngest one walked back and forth before the great looms all day, slipping the shuttle in and out, and singing to herself. By the time she was 16 years old, she was known for the most accomplished weaver in those parts. Yes, and that was all very fine too," said the house father, "but now she must go to the master weaver and learn the tricks of the trade properly, as an apprentice, and send back her wage to the family at home." That was an unheard of thing for a lass to go off a journeying by herself, and the mother was all for saying no to it, but the old crone at the end of the lane had a word in the matter. "Let her be," says the old woman, "and she will be safe enough, I warrant you, since it is just as well to be neat above all things. Here's a comb for her to carry." "That was a fine thing to have," said the lass kindly, and took the comb as cheerfully as if it had been made of silver, though it was but a broken bit of a thing, carved out of a cracked bone. So the lass set off with her bundle toward the city where the master weaver lived, with her hair done up in a handkerchief so that people would not notice her. When she had gone a great way, she reached a wood where a little silver thread of a brook was running, and where there was a better spot than that, to eat a bit, and drink a bit, and sleep a bit, and comb out her gold locks and put them in order. The lass set herself down under the ash tree and unfastened her bundle, in which her good mother had wrapped a bit of bread and cheese. She ate a bit, and at the stream she drank a bit. Then she stretched herself out under the trees and slept a bit. When she awoke, she went to the brook and washed herself. Then she took the bit of the comb and shook out the heavy locks of her hair, and began to comb them and make them neat. As the comb passed over her head, the hair followed it, so that presently the maid stood in a shining circle of gold, like a wide halo about her head. A hunter chanced to pass that way, and rubbed his eyes at the sight of her, and could he have a lock of that hair to hang a locket on? "Oh yes," said the lass, "if you can get it." So the hunter drew his knife and approached her, but he could not touch a hair of her head. Every thread of gold stood out like a shining sword, and the hunter could not come nigh the maid, but when she put up her soft hands to braid it, it seemed as sleek as it ever was. So the weaver's daughter bound up her hair in the kerchief again, and went on her way contented, and as for the hunter, he went on to Faraway, where he married a girl with hair as black as coals. By and by the maiden came to the gates of the city, where the master weaver lived, but the sentinels crossed their pikes before the gate, and would not let her in spite of all she could say. So at last she took the kerchief off her hair and began to comb it. Hey, how the soldiers did open their eyes, to be sure. They'd never seen hair like that, I can tell you. They dropped their pikes and ran forward to ask the lass for a strand of it, but the long locks followed the comb and whirled up about the maiden's head as before, and the sentinels could no more have touched her than they could have bitten a piece off that green cheese they call the moon. So the weaver's daughter walked quietly past them into the city and tied up her hair in the kerchief again. At last she came to the house of the master weaver. And did they have need of a likely lass to learn the tricks of the trade in return for a small wage? Yes, that they did. Would she come in and put down her bundle? That was what the master weaver said, and there was the bargain settled. The maid was industrious and amiable, and since she kept her hair tied up in a cap, nobody saw how truly beautiful she was, and none of the young apprentices bothered their heads about her. One day there was a great hubbub and outcry across the town, with the royal criers going up and down, crying, "Oyez, oyez, oyez," and reading a weighty message from the king. But what it was nobody could tell, any more than my grandmother's cat, since their business was to make a great noise and not to make folk hear. So everybody waited until the wide proclamations were nailed to the town walls, and then people crowded up to read them. From the king to his people, greeting, know ye all by these presents that our son, the crown prince, having come to years of discretion, declares his intention to go forth in search of adventure, more especially that which will yield combat with dragons, griffins, and other unnatural monsters of the earth, sea, and air. However, the chief lord of the royal astrologist has consulted the stars, and finds that great harm will befall the prince if he goes forth without due protection to his royal person, since a furious onslaught is to be made upon him in his first encounter. The chief lord, R.A., also finds that the only thing in the world sufficient to render his highness quite invulnerable is a garment or cloak woven of pure gold, strong enough to resist flame and the sword, but soft and pliable as velvet. It is the duty of the king, his father, and of the people, his future subjects, to procure such a robe at once. Wherefore the king commands that such a garment or cloak, as aforesaid, be forthcoming within 3 weeks hereafter, and to this he sets his hand and seal. The king, X, his mark. Well, there was a hurry and a scurry up in the goldsmith's row and in the weaver's street. Bellows were blown till the fires were white hot, looms were cleaned and set up straighter, gold was melted and gold threads were spun, and apprentices ran about as thick as hornets in sugar, with their aprons flapping in the wind. The tricky craftsmen made brass corselets and copper shields, and glozed their falseness over with gilding. The honest ones spent weary hours baking their faces and shortening their tempers over the fires, melting gold and spinning it fine enough to make into the threads for the weavers, and the weavers wove glorious garments of gold, fit for the king of the world. All this bustle and ferment went on for 2 weeks, and by that time the castle was as full of golden garments as the salt cellars of salt, but all to no avail. The chief lord of the royal astrologers shook his head over every one of them. The honest robes were as useless as the tricky ones. They were either too heavy or too stiff, or too light or too thin. There was not a one that resisted fire and the sword, and which at the same time was as soft and as pliable as velvet. So all the merchants went home again in a very unhappy frame of mind, and tried to sell the golden clothes to their neighbors at very greatly reduced prices. And all this time the weaver's daughter walked back and forth before the great looms in the master weaver's house. But she was not allowed to work on the golden vest that was made for the king's son. That was a piece of work that nobody touched but the master weaver himself. When he came home with it and threw it into a corner, the lass asked if she might have a holiday of 7 days and 7 nights. And when the master granted it without so much as looking to see who it was that asked, she put the little old comb in her pocket and went away into the woods. When she came to that place in the forest where the sun never shines at all, she took off the cap that hid her hair, combed the golden locks until they made the wood quite bright and sunny. Then one by one she broke them off until she had a lap full of shining golden threads. By and by she cut and trimmed 4 slender branches. Of these she made a loom, which she fixed against a tall tree in shuttles, small and cunningly carved. After that, she fastened some of the golden hairs up and down on the frame she had made, and ran the comb down them until they sang aloud and shone quite splendidly. And she fastened other hairs to the shuttle, and began to walk back and forth before the loom, singing to herself, and slipping the shuttles in and out. Well, for 7 days and 7 nights, the weaver's daughter worked without stopping, and then she drew the warp and the woof from the loom very carefully, and there was a shining square, as yellow as gold and as soft and thick as velvet. The lass bundled it up under her arm and tied the handkerchief over her shining cropped head, and off she went to the palace gates. And what did she want there? That was the guard speaking, and none too civilly. Oh, she was a weaver's lass who had a cloak for the king's son. Was that it in the bundle there? The guard wanted to know. Then let's have a look at it, for after all I hear better with my eyes than my ears, as the owl said to the fox when he promised her a veil and a wedding ring. So he made to grasp the bundle, but the lass unrolled it and held it up in front of her, and the guard could not so much as lay a finger on her or on the golden woven square. Off he ran to the king with his hair standing up on his head. See now, there was a lass down in the courtyard with a piece of gold cloth that was bewitched. The body could not so much as touch it, as she would have nobody take it but the prince himself. Down went the king's son, jubilant as a cock when the sun comes up, for he had feared that he might never be able to kill a dragon after all. And after him panted the chief lord of the royal astrologers to see all was right, and would it withstand fire and the sword. The prince wrapped himself in the cloak and called for torches and spears. The fire died when it came within a foot of the shining gold, and the spears turned aside from it quite blunted before they had touched it. And was it pure gold? It was woven of a virgin's hair, my lord, said the weaver's daughter, and put her hand up to her neck where the splendid hair used to be. That satisfied the prince. He tossed his sword into the air very joyfully and set off toward the stables, calling for his men to saddle his horse. So he set out to seek adventure, and the whole realm wished him Godspeed, except the weaver's daughter, who hid behind the town gate and peered through the crack with tears in her eyes. For, magic cloak or no magic cloak, the prince was bent upon the most dangerous enterprise. He might even lose the mantle in some encounter, and he was very bonny. After the prince had turned the corner of the hill and disappeared, the townspeople went back to their homes, talking very fast about the prospects of the prince's undertaking. But the weaver's lass was ashamed to go to the master weaver's house, lest somebody notice that her cap was looser than usual, and inquire what had become of her hair. So she dressed herself like a little ragged boy, and asked for work at the castle. Well, yes, there was a need of a lad to tend the pigeons in the courtyard, so the lass pulled the ragged cap over her head, and sat down by the fountains to feed the pigeons. That very night the scullion caught her mending her girl's clothes in the corner of the kitchen. It was of no use to cry and beg. The scullion said they were stolen. She could see that with half of the one eye that fortune had left her. So she took them away and wore them herself, and the weaver's daughter was left with no more clothes than the rags she stood in. Meanwhile, the town was kept agog by the news that dribbled in about the exploits of the prince. Every other day there came a messenger carrying gifts of gold and jewels from some rescued princess, or else it was a conquered knight who swore fealty to the king. People rather hoped that a grisly giant in chains or a fire-breathing dragon would come, but of these there were only messages, since the prince very properly killed them on the spot where he found them. All this time the weaver's daughter tended the pigeons, and patched her rags, and sighed when she heard about the rescued princesses. She combed her hair when nobody was about, and it shone about her head, for all that it did not grow any faster than ordinary hair, and it was no longer than a page boy's curls when the prince came home. Then there was a feasting. There were fat oxen steaming on the coals at every corner, patties and cakes without end. The fountains ran with wine and milk, and every poor man was given a new cloak, exactly the same shape as the magic square that had brought the prince safe through so many unheard-of dangers. All the court made much of him, but he laughed and shook his brown head. "This is the thing that won the victories," said he, and he smoothed the golden cloak which he wore on his shoulder all the time, and I have come home to marry the maid who cut off part of her beauty to make it for me. There was no gainsaying him, and besides, nobody but a princess could have hair like that, said the king. And so criers were sent out, proclamations were nailed up, to notify the people that the prince was waiting for his golden-haired sweetheart to appear, if she would be so kind. All the golden-haired girls in the country set out immediately for the castle, noble and gentle and simple. They filled the courtyard and swarmed up the stairs and overflowed on the terraces. Those that had the longest hair demanded precedence of the others, and those that had hair only down to their waists eked out its length with false braids and strings of jewels or beads. Never was so much yellow hair seen at once. At noon on the first day after the proclamations were sent out, the prince came out on the balcony and looked at all the yellow hair. The golden cloak was hanging from his shoulders, and it glistened in the sun. All the lasses in the courtyard looked up and jostled one another, for the prince was very fine-looking. They turned their heads this way and that so the sun would glitter on their hair, and they drew the long braids over their shoulders so that the prince could not miss seeing them. Altogether they behaved like a pack of strutting hens in my grandfather's barnyard, and over in the corner of the courtyard by the fountain sat the Pigeon Boy, who looked at nothing but the prince's brown face. There was no use for the weaver's daughter to sigh for her gold hair. How was she to stand with all these noble ladies, she who only had the clothing of the Pigeon Boy to wear? Still, though a bee carry a saber in his coat-tails, he sometimes still has honey in his pockets. Listen. By and by the prince waved his hand over all the yellow heads below him. You may all go home again. You have all got hair that reaches to your knees, and the hair of the maid who made my cloak cannot be any longer by this time than Page Boy's curls. So that was the end of that business, and for all the preening they had to go home again. That night all over town there was a great cutting and snipping, and the maids with short hair rejoiced over their proud sisters who had to cut off their long lengths of curls and braids. At noon on the second day the courtyard was as full of brides as it had been on the first day, but this time they all had short locks that waved about their ears or their shoulders. Presently the prince came out and stood with the golden cloak about him. Over in one corner, by the fountain where the Pigeon Boy stood, she could see him quite plainly. He took the cloak from his shoulders and lowered it from the edge of the balcony, holding it in his two brown hands very firmly. Now then, all the maidens were to walk past it, so that the prince could see whether their hair matched it. The lasses all streamed past, struggling to be first. The prince stood patiently all day, holding the ends of the shining cloak, looking down at the yellow heads, flaxen heads, corn-colored heads, red heads, and brown heads, and copper-colored heads that brushed past the golden cloak. But there was not one that matched it, not one in all the kingdom. So all the lasses were sent packing, with nothing but cropped heads and a little wisdom for their pains. The poor young prince stood looking after them, very doleful, with a golden cloak over his arm, and just then a white pigeon flew past the balcony with a whir, and behind him trailed a golden hair caught in its wings. The prince tried to catch it, but in vain. The next day he stood on the balcony again, but not quite so sadly. Sure enough, another white pigeon flew by, and this one had a golden hair tied about its neck. Come, that was no mischance, such as the first might have been, thought the prince. And who tended the castle pigeons now? Dear me, said the queen, how should I know? But she sent down to ask. Back came the word from the kitchen. A bit of a ragged lad who wore a ragged cap pulled over his eyes. But all the same, the prince stood on the balcony for the third day and watched the pigeons wheeling past. Presently there was one that flew more slowly than the others, and stopping to rest on the balcony railing. About its neck it had a little chain of braided golden hair, and at the end of it hung a shuttle such as weavers use, small and cunningly carved. The prince caressed the pigeon and took away its burden, and it flew away to join its fellows. The prince held the chain against his cloak with the hands that shook, and the chain and the cloak matched exactly. He flung the cloak about his shoulder and ran through the castle halls and down the winding stairs. "Send for the Pigeon Boy," says he. The whole court was on fire with expectation. They all crowded in as close as possible to see who the prince's bride was. By and by, down at the other end of the long room, the door opened, and in came the Lord Seneschal, dragging a ragged boy who held his cap to his head with both hands and could not be made to remove it. "And will you not take off your cap for me?" says the prince. He laid his hand upon it, and the cap fell off. Well, there was a great opening of eyes and wagging of tongues among the courtiers, to be sure. A great mass of golden hair that shone like fire covered the lad's little head and fell over his shoulders. "For all thy boy's attire, thou art my maid," said the prince, and he held out his hand. The Pigeon Boy took the hand and stood up quite bravely in his rags before the whole court, and the prince put his other hand behind the lad's head and pressed it against his shoulder where the golden cloak hung. It matched exactly. There was no need to look twice, said they all. The king and queen kissed their Pigeon Boy, and the court ladies hurried away to pick out clothes suitable for the wedding. So the little old woman at the end of the lane was right after all, for the weaver and his family saw nothing but good fortune from that day forward. And that is the end of this story.